Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the FinTech Superhero Spotlight Series. This is Kara Hayward, your host, Director of Partnerships for North America for Currency Cloud, and I am very excited to have Giles Sutherland, the Chief Revenue Officer for Carta Worldwide, on with me today. Welcome, Giles.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So first, before we kind of dig into our topic of the day, which is going to be focused around sort of the global approach to card issuing and card processing, I think for our audience here, not everyone has kind of met or understood Carta. And so I would love to just have a quick intro. Tell us a little bit about Carta Worldwide, what you do, and the approach that you take in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are an issuer processor, and what we usually describe as a modern issuer processor or next generation processor. And I'm going to assume that most of the audience will be familiar, but in some cases, we take the time to clarify what that is. And the easiest way I usually explain it is, the function that when you pull that card out of your wallet and you go to the merchant and use that card, most people are familiar with the acquiring processors, either the legacy players. You might see the First Data logo on that point of sale machine on the counter, or a nice fancy square dongle that you tap your card. People are very familiar with that, usually less familiar with the issuer processing side, which is basically the outsourced function of the banks. And our business started about a decade ago, basically with the thesis that there's this new wave of products and use cases and technologies coming into market. At the time, fintech wasn't really a buzzword, but what we'd all now recognize as these fintech applications and the legacy processing systems that run the debit and credit card portfolios for a lot of the banks globally fundamentally weren't really designed to support these new types of applications. So we set out to build a new processing platform for the ground up with flexible APIs and webhooks that customers could basically program their solutions on top of that technology, deploy new types of products and services for new market segments. And included in that from day one was really a global vision that would allow that processing technology to power solutions independent of a particular region or single market environment. And so there's since that time, there's been, I'd say, a crop of what we also refer to as kind of modern issuing processing. So now we're getting more attention. I think more people are understanding. But in the years past, usually I have to introduce the Carta business and the issuing processing part with a quick explainer about what issuing processing actually is, because not everyone's immediately familiar with it.
Well, fair enough. Yeah. And I think, a lot of our audience will be familiar, but a lot won't. And so thanks for going into that. I also think that it's somewhat timely that we're speaking. I think that, a lot of people saw some news, 2 days ago, I think that one of your competitors recently IPO'd. But the thing I really want to focus on today is what differentiates Carta. And I think that, what I've seen is that there are a lot of these sort of modern issuer processors, especially if you're looking at the US market, that really, helped launch a lot of these we call them embedded finance brands, right? Yeah. But they're very much domestic plays. And what I've seen is that Carta's taken a little bit of a different approach, which is thinking globally first. Yes. My understanding is although you're a Canadian company, you kind of got started in Europe and I think parts of Asia first, and then kind of came back domestically. And so I'd love to hear about why that approach, and then some of the opportunities as well as challenges you might see from taking that type of an approach.
Yeah, and great question and good observation. I think Canada is a relatively small market, maybe comparable in size to, Australia or some others. And so I think it's a relatively common thing for, technology businesses to look beyond the borders. So maybe, from a starting point, that's a little bit embedded in the DNA, and see maybe other Canadian success stories like a Shopify. Certainly they do a lot of their business outside of the border. So that's not necessarily entirely unique, but I think from an issuing, processing, and a payments perspective, one thing we identified very early on was that there's very different pace of innovation and market trends in the different regions globally. And one of the things that we identified in terms of kind of going after the low-hanging fruit was that Europe in particular represented an interesting market, and we looked at some others. And you can maybe an example that helps bring that to because something you can visualize, in Canada and Europe and some other markets, we've had chip and pin cards and contactless and all these technologies for years. And, in America and some other markets, that's still relatively recent. And so you can see there's a real different pace of how some of these technologies were coming into market. And that was both based on, some of the activity on the ground and definitely from a regulatory environment as well. And that's definitely something that we see continuing to take place globally, is as much as we think of fintech as, just this buzzword and kind of all in one, it really is financial technology. And the financial part is this heavily regulated, heavily regional business that we still haven't really quite escaped from. And then the tech part, which is, we think of Apple and Google and all these other success stories, which are just inherently global because technology itself applies to these global trends and is scalable and, ubiquitous. But we're still, even, as we see fintech exploding everywhere, still a lot of regional dynamics in play. And so coming back to your question about how we were decided to scale globally, we saw the European market and some others introducing some great things from top and bottom. So from a regulatory perspective, Europe really led the charge, opening up these e-money licenses or electronic money issuance. So you don't actually have to be a bank to start issuing cards. That's a big contrast to North America, where you do have banks that are supporting this from kind of a banking as a service function, but it requires more partnerships, a little more overhead. There's some more complexity. Europe, interestingly, operates that as a unified regulatory environment. So there's this single European Payments Association. All countries kind of adopted the same regulatory rules. In the US, 50 states, 50 different rules. You don't ever know what you're going to get, it feels like. So for us, it was really attractive to look at some of these other markets. And that was a great area for us to cut our teeth. And, I think we've also seen some of the fintechs out of Europe, being, early innovators. Not to say that for every, Revolut, Wise, Monzo, you're not going to have your Chime and whatever else. And we had, Simple and, Movin and others in the US that were certainly early on as well. But I think that really was probably the impetus for us to start looking globally. And we kept riding that trend. And we saw some of that European activity and those innovators, in some cases, actually pulling us, into new markets globally. So Wise, formerly TransferWise, is a client that we've processed for, and they have a product called the Borderless Bank Account, and it's a really interesting model. They've been, I think, a phenomenal fintech success story. Similarly, they have an IPO scheduled this year, and I think rumored to be around $7 billion valuation. So, clearly doing some things right. And we really grew with them to process their cards that at first followed a very traditional kind of US model with a third-party BIN sponsor bank. Then in parallel, they got their own issuing license, and we were able to help them scale with that. So that's where we see that issuing processing piece. In many respects, we're kind of the plumbing that allows this to happen. But where we took that, they expanded that first into a few countries and then into 25, 30, 40 plus countries now. And I think the most recent one we expanded with them was into Japan, which is a very unique market. And so it's interesting to see both the technology layer, which is our focus, as well as the consumer and business focus layer, which is a company like TransferWise, taking these elements of fintech and navigating the different country environments, different market environments. And in that case, they're being extremely successful, taking some, consistent value proposition and applying that into markets around the globe. And we've been really excited to be participating in that with them, helping them expand into new countries and processing that, borderless debit card component for it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's awesome. And I think seeing that success story and how you've helped them, and again, behind the scenes, right? Very few people who use Wise will necessarily know that Carta is the one that's kind of helping power that. But I think that's the beauty of this new embedded finance world. And sometimes, again, the heroes that we keep, I know it's a little goofy, but we're seriously saying these fintech heroes behind the scenes, because oftentimes they're not getting rewarded for that hard work, and all of that regulation they have to look at globally, the complexities of then building technology around those regulations that actually talks to each other. Yeah, it's very complicated.
Absolutely.
So I think I would love to dig a little bit more into the U.S. market, because most of our listeners today, I think, will be based out of the U.S. And one thing that we've been seeing, and I know, Carta, I think we've been talking about this a long time, is that why is this the only one, really? I mean, Revolut's kind of barely, in the U.S., like what, a year or two. They have a bit of a global focus, wise, and that's kind of it. And I think there hasn't been a lot of other, whether you call them challenger banks or other types of embedded finance models, they're launching with that immediate global focus. And I think a lot of that has been because of how complex it is to do that. So I think the U.S. market is ripe for opportunity. Can you talk a little bit? I know that you guys have recently kind of expanded into servicing the U.S. market, and can you talk a little bit about the opportunity you see there, and what you think like the future could look like in terms of opening up our borders a little bit more in the banking space?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I agree. I think that the opportunity is ripe, and we're really excited. We're as you mentioned, just recently started to expand our services into the U.S. market. We're working with a number of banking partners, and that's it's something that's not unique to the U.S., but definitely is a notable characteristic where there's a group, and they're solid partners, and there's players that are really specializing in providing the banking service, so leveraging their license, their compliance, their regulatory oversight to power these fintech applications. So they're very critical players within the ecosystem. Whereas in Europe or other markets, the fintechs might have their own banking license or being able to do more of that themselves. And so that's a really key part of it. But I think we're seeing huge opportunity opening up. And I think the market is recognizing these opportunities. And I love that you're emphasizing embedded finance, because certainly the use cases of even the Revolut or the Wise that you mentioned, some of those are very familiar because people know that experience of pulling the debit card out of their wallet, and it's a visual that they can recognize with the brand on the logo on the card itself. And what I think is interesting is some of these invisible use cases as well that we're starting to see come up. And on the one hand, you could maybe look at it as a direct result of some of the inefficiencies or friction in the market. But I think if you look at the growth of even Venmo or Square and the Cash App, part of that is a result of maybe a lack of good P2P transfers between the banks, where plenty of other markets in the world maybe have had, even if it's not quite as good, a system that gets that job done, whereas the US is kind of leapfrogged there. And I think the user experience from a Venmo, for example, is better than what a lot of the interbank rails look like in other markets. And I think there's some similar things that we're seeing where, whether it's corporate payments, whether that's from a pure expense management or automating some of the B2B transfers, there's a lot of that funds flow that's been done with very manual wire processes or ACH or others. And we're seeing really interesting innovation even on the ACH side as well, how that's starting to improve. And then on some of the use cases, and in our world, a lot of that's really focusing on virtual cards, being able to do really interesting things where you're instantly generating a virtual card that has a specific use case attached to it, controlling the transactions, what merchant that might be used for, really facilitating some interesting real-time payments and dynamic payment use cases that use the global payment rails, like our card rails, I should specify, Visa, MasterCard, to optimize this. And some of that's actually directly a result of the legacy infrastructure that's been there and hasn't quite improved. But for necessities the mother all invention, like that's really creating all these. I heard someone else describe it as this kind of Cambrian explosion of fintech use cases. So we're extremely excited and bullish on the U.S. market specifically. And although there's certainly plenty of legacy infrastructure in play, there's an incredible amount of innovation taking place. And I think that, along with some of the more systematic enhancements that are taking place, whether it's modern modernization of the payment rails that is coming on the horizon, and even some of the open banking trends, I think we're going to see just an accelerated pace of innovation starting to take shape.
That's awesome. I couldn't agree more. I'm so excited about the opportunity here, and I think that looking back at the how to make the U.S. more global, I think that the card rails are the most important way to do that, right? I mean, the fact that the payments are essentially instant, but the issue has, when you look at a card that kind of operates globally in an efficient way, that just hasn't really existed in the U.S. And I think, from what I'm seeing, Carta is very well positioned to be able to do that. It still blows my mind even how hard it is to get money across the border from the U.S. to Canada, right? And I think COVID has really exemplified that. But yeah, no, that's great. So one last question before we wrap up here. So I know that Carta actually went through their own acquisition recently, by Mogo, and I would love to hear just maybe a little bit about the synergies that you're seeing with your new parent company, and what the future looks like. Because I mean, I don't think it could be a better use case of showing here's a company that did provide embedded finance that is now kind of investing in the infrastructure that can bring it to more people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, I think it's, as you said it perfectly, it's, that's how we got introduced, and the part of the initial synergy is, seeing the entities, the companies that are, consumers of the embedded finance technology, seeing, how critical that infrastructure is. And so for us, certainly the core focus is we're going to continue to operate as a separate business, just exclusively doing the B2B core issuing, processing, that plumbing that we talked about before. I think we like to be behind the scenes, and hopefully if no one hears about our name, that's probably a good thing. We don't really want to be in the news, but and love it when our customers like Wise and others are taking and getting a lot of credit and winning in the market. But it's fantastic to have be part of a company, even and Mogo's focused specifically on the Canadian market. But they are really, I think, exemplifying that vision around fintech and both the embedded finance trends as well as a number of the others that we're really seeing converging. So, within a single technology environment, there's the core consumer payments and banking functionality, as well as some of the kind of peer-to-peer capabilities. People sometimes refer to them as kind of the Square Cash App of Canada, and then they've also have this lending platform, an investment in, we're seeing obviously with Robinhood and meme stocks, like active trading is massive. And so that coming in along with a lot of the financial health, where you're actually trying to improve and help people in a more intelligent way, and with this sustainability mindset where you can actually offset your transactions with your carbon footprint, and then all linking even the crypto exchange into that is a really fascinating thing. So for us as a infrastructure provider, having a partner that's really pushing the limits on innovation and almost like a test bed that helps us keep pushing the envelope on innovation, that we can bring some of that learning as we help enable our clients, and almost have it like a proof point in a separate market to say, here's some of the interesting things we're doing over there. And we've already seen a lot of traction where customers are seeing some of the things and innovative things we're incubating with kind of, with our own, hear it sometimes referred to as like eating your own dog food. We're testing these things out. And that's a fantastic way to kind of keep ourselves really at the forefront of the market and being able to add a bit more value to our customers as we're trying to be really consultative and help them in turn really innovate and drive their new products forward.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your insights today. Anything else you want to share with the audience before we wrap up today?
No, I think I really enjoyed having the chance to speak with you, and I'm glad you highlighted that we're fresh into the U.S. market. We're really excited to dig in, and I know we've had, I think, a great track record elsewhere, and so hopefully the next time we do one of these, we're a little more recognized in the market, and we're that momentum is more evident. But thank you again for having me.
I'm excited for it. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.